Right, so I believe we are live. Welcome all, and thanks for joining us on this afternoon in DC, where I am based. Although, given we are a global organization, greetings from whatever time zone, whatever time of day in the world you may be, yeah, you may be at. My name is Miriam Zeringkalam. I am the Senior Director of Policy at the Center for Open Science. And I'm really excited to be talking with you about the work that we have been doing with collaborators at many different organizations to develop a strategic plan for the Coalition for Resilient Research Data Infrastructure, or CRRDI. So I am joined today with my esteemed collaborators, or some of my esteemed collaborators. We have Christopher Stephen Markham from the Data Foundation and Federation of American Scientists, as well as a whole bunch of other affiliations and hats that he wears. Linda Kellum from the University of Pennsylvania Libraries and the Data Rescue Project. Christine Kirkpatrick from the UC San Diego Supercomputing Center, and Alex Wade, who is our project consultant on this and holds affiliations with Washington University as well as other organizations. And so we make up a part of the strategic planning committee that went into developing this plan, which we are excited to be sharing more about with you all today. And so before we get into it, we wanted to have, to set up some ground rules or key features and capabilities in this webinar. We have a polling function, and we're really curious about sort of where in the data repository infrastructure system you sit in. And so that poll should be going off now. And throughout this webinar, you also have an opportunity to ask questions or share comments through the Q&A feature on this webinar. And so, part of this is to share with you this draft strategic plan that we have developed. But it is also to hear back from you what questions, comments, ideas you may have as we work on, developing this draft strategic plan into a finalized strategy for this proposed coalition. And so first, I wanted to share a bit about how it is that this effort started. And so it kind of came out of work from the Center for Open Science. And for those of you who might not be familiar with us, we are a nonprofit organization with a mission to increase the openness, integrity, and trustworthiness of research. And we do this to sort of work towards our true north, which is life cycle open science. And we define that as research with publicly accessible plans, contents like data, materials, and code, and outcomes that are linked and findable in a persistent open location. We're also an infrastructure provider through the Open Science Framework, which can surface these connections to really show you the life cycle of open research. So researchers can start by pre-registering their study plans, and as they undertake their work, link to outputs and outcomes that are hosted anywhere as they become available, giving this complete view of how research is progressing over the life cycle from study plan to outcomes. Now, achieving our true north requires persistent and reliable access to those outputs and outcomes so that those linkages are long lasting, are trustworthy, are robust. And so the core of our vision for lifecycle open science is the belief, conviction that research information, including data, is a public good. And so reaping the benefits of this public good requires persistent and reliable access to those outputs and outcomes, which is to say the infrastructure that enables, in this case, data to be shared, linked, discovered, accessed, understood, and used in context. Yet these infrastructures have long been at risk from a variety of factors like chronic underfunding, including a tendency to favor funding new innovations and new innovations over the maintenance of core capabilities, overstretched staff, incentives to fragment the system rather than supporting convergence around shared capabilities like standards and metadata, and vulnerabilities due to shifting policy priorities. And we've really seen these risks sort of exacerbated and come to bear in the last few years in a pretty stark way. And that's led to several data resilience, preservation, and rescue efforts that here at the Center for Open Science we've been really inspired by, including work led by the faces that you see before you. And those efforts have had different scopes, but for our purpose at the Center for Open Science, we're particularly interested in infrastructure that provides access to federally funded research data, which falls under the remit of the 2022 Office of Science and Technology Public Access Policy, which is to say data that are of sufficient quality to validate and replicate research findings, which is generated with support from the US government. So that can include intramural research, grants, contracts, cooperative agreements, and so on. And that also means that ownership of this data varies and could be the government, an institution, or individual. All of these kinds of things are in scope and of interest to us. And while I recognize that administration priorities have shifted, open science policies like those advanced with the 2022 public access guidance continue to be a priority under this administration, under the auspices of gold standard science. And we could have a whole other conversation around that, but I'll leave it there for now. Um, and so the open science community has done a ton of really important advocacy to move policies forward towards greater openness. And we want to make sure that that progress continues, which means that if we are going to ask researchers to make their data, to make their outputs more open, accessible, understandable, to link them together and provide that context of openness throughout the research lifecycle, we need to make sure that we're enabling a more resilient ecosystem for research data infrastructures. So that they are resistant to single points of failure and that we can believe and have confidence that they will be preserved in the long term. And so single points of failure may include a funding cut when there is a lack of diverse funding streams, a natural disaster where there is no backup protocol, or a shift in institutional priorities where a repository lacks multi-institutional stewardship. And so, a sort of second question or challenge is how can we do this? How can we enable greater resilience across a really distributed system to solve this challenge together? Because no one organization or initiative or repository is going to be able to do it on its own to save us, to save all of the data in its entirety. And so, first, I want to sort of be clear about what it is that we mean by resilience. And we drew from a definition that was put forward by work that was done by the Earth Science Information Partners, or ESIP, that you can find in a report that I provided the DOI in this slide. But it's the ability to make important data accessible, recoverable, and useful under both normal operations and crisis conditions. And so, again, this really requires collaboration across the system at a really massive scale because data are housed in a highly distributed system of thousands of repositories across disciplines with different data users, curators, depositors, and so on. And so, what does it really look like to coordinate our efforts to make the most efficient, effective use of limited resources and, again, drive towards greater resilience for the system? And so COS, again, recognizing that we could not do this on our own, and that there's so many incredible efforts and initiatives that have been long-standing, looked out to the community, to leaders in the community, to help us try to answer these questions and develop a strategy for how we move this forward. And so we're really honored to be working with this great set of people here who really act as who we see as leaders in this field and who have really rich connections and relationships out into the broader data and repository and information infrastructure system. And so we got funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to help us sort of pool together these great minds and think over the last year about what is needed in order to drive towards greater resilience. And so with that, I will turn to one of these great minds, Linda Kellum, to take it from here.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to talk with you all. I'm Linda Kellum. I'm the Director of Research Data and Digital Scholarship at Penn Libraries and one of the co-founders and director of the Data Rescue Project. So as Miriam mentioned many times, the cutting across all of our work is a commitment to collaboration. We want to be informed by the landscape that is existing. And so part of our effort has been on a landscape analysis of the existing related efforts so that we can ensure that our approach is very complementary. The goal for the plan is to act as an anchoring framework or scaffold for coordinating related initiatives so that the community can organize to promote a shared vision for a more resilient ecosystem. And we're thinking about how we sustain and govern that moving forward. This is why we have a dedicated discussion that also within the strategic plan about governance, as well as the call for action and the pillars that you'll see. So next slide. So after a few months of exploratory work, we gathered in DC in March to build out our strategic plan. And this is the case for action that we came up with as a group. These are some of the core assumptions that we have as we entered into the planning process. First off, federally funded research data is a non-rivalous public good. And I think can hear that across many of our organizations as we talk about public data as a public good. Second, that the use of public data relies on robust and resilient data repositories and related infrastructures and trying to find ways to bolster those as much as possible. Third, those infrastructures have long been at risk, but those risks have become clearer to us over the past few years. Fourth, government support is essential, but can be made more efficient through coordination across sectors. And finally, that we can't go back. We can't wish for a past that doesn't exist anymore. We need to think about what we have and where we're going from here. So the result of this case for action, this call for action, is a strategic plan. And we're sharing it with you because we want to know your thoughts and whether the elements in the strategic plan resonate with your communities. And if it doesn't, if something doesn't, how do you think we should shape it to meet the needs, concerns, and opportunities of your specific community? Next slide. So the case for action builds towards our vision that we're working to achieve through our strategic planning process and that we've been working on for over the past year. We're hoping to enact the plan over the next 3 years or so. And this plan really seeks to identify the conditions or the recommendations and strategies that advance the work and the governance structure for a coalition that will collaboratively cultivate a resilient data ecosystem for publicly funded research. So working across different organizations and bringing together organizations to find a way forward to create a resilient data ecosystem. Next slide. So rather than launching one more initiative that competes with other groups and similar groups, CRRDI, the group that we've brought together, has really worked to align the rescue advocacy and technical communities around shared priorities. We're hoping to build shared accountability for sharing resources effectively. And we want to do this in these 3 ways. So one is advocating and building awareness. We want to learn and borrow from other data rescue and digital preservation efforts and amplify what they're doing. 2 is to reduce redundancies across efforts. So when we do see something that's being done in a different organization, thinking through how we can work together or how organizations can work together. And finally, supporting long-term infrastructure in our efforts. Next slide, please. And we see 3 distinct groups in this as our audience, although there's definitely overlap in these, and there may be other audiences that you feel are missing from this. But the first are the doers. This is my area, I think. So those involved in data rescue, preservation, and providing infrastructure. So it's the doers, not just in terms of what we've had to do over the past couple of years, or past 19 months, but over the past few years, the people who are actually working to preserve and provide infrastructure. Second is the supporters, those who want and have the means to support our work through funding, policy advocacy, and in other areas. And finally, the beneficiaries. Those are the researchers and other users who benefit from our efforts to support data infrastructure. So these are our core audiences and the people we're thinking about as we were creating the strategic plan. Hopefully you see yourself in here, and if not, we would love to know that as well. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Chris Markham.
Thanks so much, Linda. I join you in being grateful to be able to join everybody today at Center for Open Science for this review. As both Miriam and Linda had said, publicly funded research data is a vital public good. It fuels scientific discovery, drives innovation, and really belongs to the community at large, belongs to all of us. But the repository ecosystem that federally funded research data relies on is surprisingly fragile. And that's what the strategic plan is recognizing in the work that we're doing in this group. Repositories face fairly consistent threats, from budget cuts to policy shifts to technical issues and staff turnover. To tackle these vulnerabilities, the proposed strategic plan focuses on three core pillars, and I'll walk through them with some detail. First, pillar one focuses on assessment and monitoring. This is our assess and monitor the repository landscape pillar. We need a clear shared model to track and evaluate where the repository ecosystem is most vulnerable and how those risks can change over time. Second, pillar number two in the proposed strategy is to develop diverse, sustained funding and governance. This tackles long-term stability through collective governance for the federal repository ecosystem. The pillar focuses on coordinating investment in the repository ecosystem to build robustness and sustainability into funding models so it can survive threats or single points of failure in the future. And finally, pillar three, which is build a shared outreach and advocacy and action strategy, centers on community and collective action. This is like really putting the community into this strategy was very important to us. We can't do it alone, as Miriam said. And so we need to foster an environment that equips researchers, stewards, and advocates, and the three buckets that Linda had just described, and of course the public at large, with the toolkit that they need to maintain the signal of the value of data on the one hand, and to respond to active threats in the ecosystem on the other. Now I'll turn to a bit more detail on pillar one before handing the stage over to Alex and to Christine to dive a little bit more into pillars 2 and 3. So next slide, please. Excuse me. So pillar one, assess and monitor the repository landscape, recognizes that our understanding where the baseline risks and strengths are where they are is an essential first step in building resilience to the repository ecosystem. So we have to obtain that assessment. Right now, if a funding stream dries up, or if staff is de-resourced, or staff members leave, or a policy priority changes, an entire repository can disappear, or the data within it can wither. Those are single points of failure, and that we often don't see coming until it's too late and they're right at the door. Importantly, pillar one is not about reinventing the wheel or remapping the ground the community has already made a lot of headway on, and doesn't tread on what our common understanding is. It's not duplicative. A lot of great work has already been done to measure the digital preservation and data quality. Our goal here is to bring those existing tools together into a unified framework by establishing a common language for risk that we can help funders and agencies and stewards spot weaknesses early, and to protect our collective public investment in data in the long term. Next slide, please. So the pillar one really has three big components. The first this slide describes how we plan to operationalize pillar one in practice. We have three concrete steps here. First, we're developing a shared maturity model that gives the entire community a standardized way to evaluate repository resilience that is both comparative and introspective. Instead of grading repositories on a sort of pass-fail basis, it really evaluates specific operational capabilities for the repositories, like whether a repository has backup funding, or if there's a succession plan in place, or if there's distributed storage across multiple sites. Second, we recognize in the strategic plan that we need a comprehensive landscape analysis that maps the repositories that host federally funded research data And the goal of that is really to help understand the systematic gaps and risks, but also the strengths of what exists in the current system. For example, two repositories that might look perfectly healthy on paper, but if they're both relying on the same underlying software dependency or storage provider, that might be a point of failure that is susceptible to both. And that shared dependency really needs to be revealed. And third, to help with accessibility and insights revealed in both the landscape analysis and the maturity model, the plan proposes a repository resilience dashboard. This should serve as an open community-driven tool that will monitor repositories over time. Our hope is that the dashboard will give information stewards and supporters an accessible early warning system so we can direct resources and assistance and let people know when data rescue and where critical need is needed most. Next slide, please. So the big component of Pillar 1 is the repository resilience maturity model. I thought we'd take a look at the whole model overall and give you a glimpse into what we're thinking here. To ensure that we're capturing the full picture of health of any given repository, the model evaluates each repository according to sort of 8 core dimensions. They're listed here. If you can't, the print's a little small, so I'll read them. It's organizational and financial stability, governance, transparency, and accountability, data stewardship and integrity, the FAIR data principles, that's making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, software and technical dependencies, technical infrastructure and security, community use, and crisis readiness and resilience. So those are their 8 core dimensions, and they're assessed across criteria in 4 very plain, simple to understand stages of maturity. An initial stage where operations are ad hoc with limited capacity, an emerging stage where capacity is driven by immediate requirements and need. Established is a more mature aspects of the maturity model where the repositories are formalized and implementation might still be bumpy, but it has regular standing operating procedure. And optimized. And this is where resilience is very deeply embedded and routinely tested and robust and continuously improved. The maturity model synthesizes 5 established frameworks. We're not, again, building anything new. We're trying to build on the work that's already been done and that are already trusted by the community. These include Core Trust Seal, the National Digital Stewardship Alliance levels of digital preservation, and the National Science and Technology Council's desirable characteristics for federally funded data repositories, which a number of us on this working group have contributed to. So the maturity model is designed to be practical and transparent and actionable. The initial proposal model is published separately on Zenodo, and the link is there on the screen. We welcome your feedback on it. And I'll turn it over to Alex now to discuss Pillar 2 and provide some more insight into one of the aspects of the maturity model.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris. My name is Alex Wade, and the second pillar of the strategy here is really to focus in on a couple of those facets. So if you go to the next slide, please. So within the maturity model, the top 2, or first 2 pillars, first 2 facets, I should say, are organizational and financial stability, and also governance, transparency, and accountability. So if we explode those a little bit more, I'm not going to read through them, but next slide, please. If you download from Zenodo the draft maturity model, you'll see this progression, as Chris outlined, from the sort of initial ad hoc stages to a more optimized and robust model. And so specifically, Pillar 2 wants to focus on developing out the set of sustainable business models for research data infrastructure, and also to establish a multi-sectoral governance mechanism so that we can create some shared accountability and put the structures in place to sustain the ecosystem in the long term. Specifically addressing some of the single points of failure risks that Chris outlined, we want to support a progression within this maturity model from sort of left to right. Our aim isn't to say everybody needs to be fully at the right hand side of this model, but at each stage it sort of highlights and you can infer what some of the risks might be if you are too far to the left in that model. And so we want to facilitate some increased coordination across the ecosystem so that each repository isn't trying to sort of evaluate and move within this maturity model on their own. And we want to maximize the resources and share practices across the repositories and the players in the ecosystem. So to that end, one of the things that we would like to do is to survey and catalog the existing and even proposed business models and implementation methods, as well as to identify opportunities to develop and test innovative business models so that we can create a menu of options that repositories and funders can draw upon. We recognize, of course, that there is no one size fits all. So there isn't going to be a single answer to this, and it's going to be highly dependent on the repository type, the funding context, the life cycle stage of the repository. So part of the goal of this catalog of business models is also to sort of highlight the trade-offs and advantages of different approaches there. Once we have that, we would like to we would like to pilot some of the promising models with willing repository partners, with resourcing from aligned funders, and ultimately to document some of the lessons learned that comes out of those pilots. And then we'd like to publish that really with sort of some broader recommendations to the community for wider adoption. Secondly, I'll go on to the next slide here. Secondly, we would like to establish a cross-sectoral consortium for collaborative funding and also for incentives so that the investments that the community is making, funders, the government is making in research data repositories can be better coordinated. We would like to see this composed of senior representatives from government, from industry, from academia, and from civil society, but specifically those who hold decision-making authority and those that can commit resources to the effort. So clear incentives for participation and shared buy-in around a common infrastructure approach would be essential to this. And we're not naive. We recognize that there have been past interagency and multi-sectoral efforts that may have faltered from insufficient authority or insufficient resources at the time. So we intend to apply lessons learned from this to build a more durable coordination for the core data services that can scale and can adapt over time. Next slide, I think, goes on to back to Linda.
Hello again. So in Pillar 3, we aim to develop a shared outreach, advocacy, and action strategy. And the goal of this pillar is to equip the community to make the case for sustained investment. In addition, this pillar encompasses the need to respond when data are at risk. Effective outreach and advocacy must be grounded in a clear picture of existing risks and fragilities, and to make the case that in order to make the case for sustained investment in data. Therefore, this pillar equips the communities with the tools, messaging, and capacity to act. We also see this pillar coming from a global perspective. While most of our perspectives are really focused on the United States, we recognize that public data is a concern not just for the United States. And so going to one of the questions in the Q&A, that we do see this pillar in particular encompassing a broader perspective. Next slide. So the focus of this pillar is on amplification of the need for action. As a member of the Pillar 3 development team, for me, it's critical that we continue to think about advocacy and outreach as key actions and not afterthoughts. So within this, first, we want to align and coordinate with related efforts to avoid to avoid duplication. So the goal here, some of the activities here, are to map existing related initiatives across the ecosystem and identify overlaps, gaps, and opportunities. We also want to look for opportunities to bring them into the living roadmap in ways that complement our existing efforts. So if there are other groups that are working in these are taking action in different ways, that we can bring them into the efforts that we have. And then I think very importantly to establish ongoing touch points to keep those organizations engaged and informed as our work evolves. Second, we call for the development of communication and advocacy toolkits that can clearly and concisely make the case for the importance of public data and federally funded repositories. Having these in place for the community would answer a real need and a gap that we've seen over the past year. And so some of the activities here include an environmental scan of existing community and advocacy resources across our ecosystem, as well as prioritizing and developing toolkits that can do things like advocate to legislatures for safeguarding data, making the case to funders for sustainable funding models, and general purpose messaging for broader audiences. Our third point is to build community capacity to report at-risk resources and advocate for sustainable and resilient infrastructure. So this could include curating and amplifying existing resources, directing community members to the best available tools and materials for accessing preserved data sets, reporting at-risk resources, and addressing all the gaps as needed. And finally, implementing short-term crisis response strategies and developing best practices for resilience. So part of this, we would like to convene practitioners across efforts to share resources and identify what has worked and what has not and why, as well as leveraging existing crisis response mapping efforts that you'll hear about soon, probably. We'd like to maintain a community of the willing, standing network able to respond to emergent issues in data stewardship, and then document the lessons we've learned from both the crisis response community, as well as translating them into best practices for sustained infrastructure. So these are the main activities we see for Pillar 3. Now I'm going to hand it over to Christine Kirkpatrick, who's going to talk about the governance models.
Thanks so much, Linda. And next slide, please. So we have a consortium structure in the strategic plan that draws on community practices and include governance models refined over time and via real-world challenges by data-driven consortia, some of which you participants have been involved and helped to refine. I've been part of the Stakeholder Alignment Collaborative where we draw some of this knowledge from, and including our recent book, The Consortia Century. The work itself is driven purposefully by a consortium of community interest holders who participate in shared governance. And this is to drive equity, as well as to ensure buy-in on decisions so that you can successfully implement these things and have people adhere to community norms. And this is just meant as a starting point. It can be adapted to the specific context of the consortium once it's been established. To give you a couple quick highlights, but please do read the plan and comment. We talk about a minimum viable consortium, so just enough structure that can be iterated as needed. And this concept of staggered terms for officers and a steering committee, how voting, membership, and other aspects would work. And we do talk a bit about or reference Eleanor Ostrom's work, which really points basically to the need to set expectations for behavior and the ramifications for acting outside those norms. And we again reference something from ESIP that was mentioned earlier, and its community participation guidelines that were based on the Mozilla Foundation. And finally, we acknowledge that such a consortium may need an eventual plan for winding down, and so to be purposeful about not just the beginning, but the end as well. And let me turn it back over to you.
All right. So this is the portion where I say again that this plan that we have released is a draft. It is sort of from months of work with this strategic planning committee and is now in a form that we really want input from the broader community so that, we really mean what we say when we're saying this is a community-driven strategy. We want to make sure that existing efforts, initiatives, resources, infrastructures are reflected in this kind of work rather than, duplicating efforts or going off in sort of parallel directions in a way that might not be as constructive as it possibly could be. So, in tandem with releasing the strategic plan, we also released a Google form for folks to provide input and are planning on hosting sessions in other forums to continue to get sort of like live in real time feedback. Is coming through the Q&A function right now, which is really, really wonderful. Specifically, things that we are interested in knowing is, do the strategies that we outline in this strategic plan that we've touched on in this webinar serve the ecosystem's needs with respect to long-term repository resilience? What's missing in here that we really need to be mentioning or calling attention to? Are the strategies feasible given current realities? Where do you see obstacles that should be on our radar or opportunities that should also be on our radar? What existing work, resources, or initiatives should this plan be referencing or building on, whether we reference them explicitly in the strategic plan or for reasons that make a lot of sense? These efforts are sort of flying lower on the radar, but should still be sort of built on and worked on uh, constructively. And then, what specific input might you have on the pillars and the proposed governance model that Christine walked through? And perhaps most importantly, are you interested in joining or supporting CRRDI, and how? So I'm going to pull up in the poll again, if we could, a question about sort of like where in this system are you coming from? As we sort of start to move into ways to comment. So as I mentioned, there's the Google form. You can scan for the QR code there, and we'll also have a follow-up for attendees of this webinar so that you can enjoy it via email. You can email us at dataresilience@cos.io. And then we're also going to be hosting office hours with partner organizations in order to provide feedback in that way. And so comments are open through September 30th, at which point we will be incorporating those comments into a final draft, which we're aiming to publish in November, along with some details about initial steps towards implementation. And so, to give you like a little snapshot of where we're at, so that we can now move into the Q&A portion, I will just leave up here the pillars of the strategic plan as well as a high-level summary of the strategies in there. And we can start to work through the questions, and I'll do my best to serve as moderator as we answer them live. So it's cool to see where you all are sitting. Oh, and great. We've also flashed up another poll that you can sort of muse on about, how you might be interested in staying in touch or involved with CRRDI as we continue to move forward. So I will go to the first. I'll group the first two questions, which are really around the geographic focus or scope for the plan. So is this focused on US-based infrastructures? Are we planning on including international initiatives? Chris, I believe that you were starting to draft a response. So great. Christopher Markham is going to answer this live.
On an unexpected twist, I'll be answering this live. Yeah, so I think this is a great question. There are a number of questions in the chat about what the geographic focus is, whether there's international considerations, how this would apply to, say, the Middle East and the Global South. I think these are all fantastic questions. In our current instantiation, in our initial thinking, we have been focused on U.S. federally funded research data ecosystem. However, that does not mean that we have a moratorium or anything on international collaboration and participation. And so we'd welcome those ideas. We think there are probably lessons learned that would be very valuable, say, from the non-U.S. context. The other aspect of this is that the eventual deliverables and outputs from the work that the CRRDI will do should be generalizable and should be quite useful to the global community. And by putting it in the public domain, we hope that will be part of the paying back to the global data research ecosystem.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Chris. And I think that there's a related question around, that I've been receiving around, do you only care about repositories that house US funded data? And I think the answer is that I can't quite think of a repository. Well, I guess I can think of repositories that only host US funded research data. But many of the data repositories that we are looking at and focused on are open for deposit from, private funders, from international funders. And so these infrastructures are not, bordered sort of like geographic enclaves necessarily. Alex, you might want to talk about some of the work that you've been doing, sort of surveying repositories, or you might have a different comment entirely.
Well, no, I was going to pile on to both what Chris and you have said and there's another dimension to this question, which isn't just what the data is about or how the data is funded, but it's about the global community of researchers. And as you know, the research communities are not geographically bound per se. So I think there's a very real aspect of the beneficiaries of the data that are outside of the US. And one could look at the resilience there and say, my research or my research domain is entirely single funded by some US federal agency. So there's some very good examples, I think, especially in the biomedical space, of resources that are now governed multinationally, have transnational replicated repositories. And so while this initial effort with CRRDI was focused on US federally funded data, I don't think that the breadth of the community that we want to involve needs to be geographically bound that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we were just kind of thinking about what is the scoping that makes the most sense rather than thinking about how can we do it all. Um, so I will now move on to the next question, which I think I may need some clarification from the asker. Oscar Javier Guerrero Gutierrez asks, are there plans to include a layer of peer review of the contributions to the repository ecosystem? I'm not sure that I understand whether this is asking about whether we are planning to do a review of the quality of data sets, which I would say no, we're not looking at sort of quality assessment, quality control of data sets. But if that was not your question, if you could comment in there, or if somebody else wants to chime in there before we move on to the next question. Okay, so not just quality. Yeah, if you could clarify, we can come back to that question. The next one is around evaluating repositories against a standardized maturity model may disadvantage smaller, under-resourced, or marginalized research institutions that lack the infrastructure to meet centralized compliance standards. How can this be addressed, if at all? So we had talked a lot about the sort of naming of a maturity model as not wanting it to seem like we were scoring or grading repositories, but rather giving them a sense of where they currently stand and where that they stand in context or in comparison to other repositories as a way of thinking about, are there ways that we can share resources, share tooling, share infrastructures to help those less well-resourced but still very important repository infrastructures sort of like move up. So being able to look across the landscape and see like these are some core areas where we need more tooling in order to move along that maturity model. We are open to ideas of another thing to call it that might, sound a bit less judgmental, but it's really, I think, aimed at helping along infrastructures that may have less access to resourcing to think about what are ways that we can more effectively collaborate and coordinate to be sort of like moving further to the right of that maturity model towards, I can't remember what the highest level is. Linda, you can go
Optimizing.
ahead.
Optimizing is the highest. And I think that was why it was so important that we drew on the existing models that are out there, such as Quartz Seal and ESIPs and the others. As somebody who works closely with Quartz Seal, I think the thing to keep in mind is looking. The goal is to look strategically and fully at where you are in and being able to rate yourself, not be rated by others. And so that really is the and not even seen as a rating. It's just kind of giving yourself an indicator of where you are in terms of developing the infrastructure around the repository. So I think this is definitely a great question, definitely something that we talked a lot about within the CRRDI group when it comes to the different kinds of repositories that are out there. But hopefully this will still be a useful tool for people.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for that, Linda. And something that we have talked very, very and thought very long and hard about, and would really, really value input from you all at data-resilience@cos.io. I think relatedly is the question from Shannon on who is doing the evaluating of the repository. Is this a tool that you plug in, an application we submit, or our own analysis? So we were sort of conceptualizing this as a self-assessment, recognizing that some of the dimensions within that model are things that an outsider might not have access to or even be able to answer. And so, part of that is also thinking about like how can we sort of incentivize people to opt in and do these kinds of assessments, and kind of contribute them, and what are ways that we can do this so that repositories aren't necessarily putting themselves at greater risk by maybe saying that like we're not, totally towards the optimizing end of the spectrum. So that's something continues to be an active and live conversation. But I don't know if any of my other colleagues or collaborators have anything that they want to add to that. Maybe Chris, anything on sort of like dashboarding that draws from your. Okay, no. Okay, great. All right, from Carrie, what metrics will you use to assess reusability in the FAIR acronym, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable? Or is that still coming together? I think still coming together, but perhaps my colleagues may have more to say or want to talk more about that.
I'm going to, I'll say one thing and then I'm going to ask Christine to chime in because I think Christine has a lot of expertise
Yeah, I wanted to
in
ask Christine, but I
Christine has
was
a lot
like,
of
is that
expertise
too aggressive for a Friday afternoon?
in helping organizations bring up their data standards into fairness. But I will say that just like Miriam said, the entire plan is definitely still coming together and open for suggestions. And so if you have good metrics and good and best practices, please share them with us. And but I think maybe Christine may have a word or two to say about this.
Yeah, although you might be disappointed how existential my answer is. I mean, I think the reality is that the moment you create metrics, they're almost out of date and they are very specific to the type of thing you're trying to do, right? The use case, the domain that you're working in. Um, so I mean, I think the FAIR principles have survived over these 10 years because they were not specific and they're more about concepts. But really, when it gets into how do you measure if something's reusable, that really needs to be based on the implementation of those principles. And so these are things I think best worked out in working groups that are um, steeped in the context of the domain and what someone is trying to do. And we're trying to uh, think broadly over these larger concepts of how do you keep repositories alive and how do you plan for all of these things that inevitably happen uh, for a variety of reasons, many of which have been referenced here in the chat and which have really broadened our thinking too about this. So I hope that's not too much of a double speak answer, but I don't want to also lie and say, oh yeah, I've got an Excel spreadsheet that has all of the answers for you and it will work in all cases.
Alex, go ahead.
I was one of the in a previous life when I was working for a funder, I was one of the members of the Global Biodata Coalition. It was something that we struggled with on the application process for the core global biodata resources. And because research community sizes are different, we tended to measure a number of different things. So in some cases, citations or mentions of the resource was an indication of reusability, that it got reused. But in other cases, just understanding what the global web traffic to the tool was, or number of downloads, or number of API accesses. So there was a whole spectrum of statistics that we looked at that all needed to be triangulated across the reach and the size of the research community. So there wasn't any bottom line way to combine these into a single metric.
Great. I see that we have 9 minutes left, so I'm trying to sort of quickly scroll down and see. So I did see I've seen a few questions about sort of how our work relates to the American Geophysical Union's global data resilience work. And the answer is quite a bit. So AGU's work is more specifically focused on the earth and environmental sciences, earth, space, environment, and we have more of a discipline agnostic remit. But we are and have been working very closely with AGU and have quite a lot of sort of like crosstalk and synergy between folks who are involved in that effort and folks who have been sort of like leading the way in the charge with CRRDI to make sure that we are not duplicating efforts that don't need to be duplicated, that we are collaborating in ways that are effective, but also recognizing that, AGU's work is going to specialize in ways that ours isn't going to get as deep in the weeds, and their remit is more global. So while we're looking more at those US repositories that are in the US context, but that do house, as we discussed, data globally. AGU is looking broader than that. So I don't remember where exactly that question was, but I will say I will call that question answered.
I answered it. I typed an answer too, so that's why.
Oh, great, great. All right. Let's see.
I thought Amit Shirazia had a great question. Not that I know the answer, but I thought we could reflect on it. He's basically calling out that there's a gap between the perspective of people like CRRDI, which, by the way, I don't know if we've said, great acronym. I love the humility of it. I'm proud to be part of it. But also the researchers mostly, but also consumers broadly, and then people producing the data. And, if there's any tension in those gaps between what we think is needed versus what, a panel of researchers might say. And I think this is because he's someone who's trying to serve uh, uh, layers that sit on top of infrastructure that answer some of these challenges. So what do we think is missing between what a panel of people like us would say and data users, for example?
I mean, I think just some off the cuff thoughts. I think that from in my prior life as a researcher, infrastructure I think that works really well is infrastructure that we can kind of take for granted because it's seamless. And so all of the kind of people power, all of the infrastructure, all of the like data storage and where that lives can seem kind of abstract when you are a user or a depositor. And so there's things that, there's challenges I think that are unseen in that sense. And then I think that there's also something that we've discussed and uh, is kind of around like how do we think about business models that enable sustainability of these infrastructures and what is the role of sort of paying into these systems. So we've talked about sort of in our discussions around industry, and they benefit quite a great deal from, openly available data sets. And the infrastructures that house those data sets. And yet their contributions, where they have an ability to make them, doesn't really flow back. And so, how do you kind of work through that? So I think that there's just these different dependencies and ways that we interact with infrastructures that, like, when everything is working great and smoothly, you take it for granted and you're like, of course, this thing will be here forever. But I think, and so all of the work that goes on behind the scenes really remains invisible. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but I think we're also thinking about like how do you make these pieces more visible and bring them into an advocacy strategy that is more unified, so that people who are depositing into those systems that are really important to them or who are drawing data from systems that are really important to them are able to sort of like advocate for the need to sustain them even though they're not going to be talking as much in the weeds about like some of the nitty-gritty details that an infrastructure person might. So I don't know if anybody else on this call has thoughts. I mean, probably, but I'll be quiet now. Okay, I'll call that question done. Um, are there
I
other
think
questions
you,
that? Okay.
oh, sorry, Miriam. I was just going to say, I think you had the perspective succinctly nailed when you said they just want it to be there. That pretty much, yeah, covers it. I mean, think of how we use Google, right? Or I guess now it would be, choose your AI tool. Clean interface, just works, hides all the abstraction.
Linda, go ahead.
Can I answer Wanda's question?
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I just want to, so and Wanda's asking, can you give us in simple terms how this benefits? And so I think this is a great question. And I personally see two major benefits in this. One is the coordination around these key pillars, and providing some kind of organizing framework that moves us forward rather than kind of the ad hoc efforts that we've been doing in the past. And so I was very excited to join BCREDI because of that, because I think that we need to have a plan for how we move forward together, and coordinate amongst all the different groups that are out there. Two, I think where I see a lot of importance from this is filling in the gaps, figuring out where we have a lot of tools that are being created. We have a lot of people doing work, but we need to figure out where the gaps are in that work. And so that's a big part of what CRRDI is trying to do is understand where are the gaps. And an example of this, I think for me, is in thinking through the advocacy toolkits, because we have been asked for advocacy toolkit for legislation that could be created to protect data, and that's not something that we have. So trying to identify places that we have gaps that could be answered not just by us, but by groups that are working in this effort. So hopefully, Wanda, that helps to answer your question. Some.
And I think that was a great question to end on, since we just have a minute left. So want to thank all of you for taking the time on a Friday in August to join us. And sharing again that you can share your thoughts with us at data resilience at cos.io, as well as in that Google form that I just shared. That form will have a link to the draft strategic plan, which I will also, if I am fast enough, drop that into the chat. And we look forward to this has already been such a rich discussion, and the plan has only been out for a week now. And so I'm really excited for the kinds of feedback and thoughts and energy that we get back from this community. So please, if you can join me in thanking as well, Chris, Linda, Alex, and Christine, as well as I see in the audience some of our fellow CRRDI Strategic Plan Committee members. So thank you for all of your efforts, as well as our COS comms team for being behind the scenes and making it all go smoothly. So please look out for a follow-up email with a recording to this and links. And we look forward to hearing more of your feedback and thoughts. Have a great rest of your day.